All right, welcome to the STOA. Today's session is called the Authentic Relating Movement, and we have three past guests of the STOA who are central to what is known as the Authentic Relating Movement. We have Susan Campbell, the grandmother of the Authentic Relating Movement, author of such books as Getting Real, 10 Truth Skills You Need to Live an Authentic Life. And if Susan is the grandmother, then the parents perhaps are Jason and Sara. Jason Diggs, the co-founder of Art International and author of Conflict and Energy, the transformative practice of authentic relating, and Sara Ness, the chief instigator of Authentic Revolution, who compiled the Authentic Relating Games Manual. So we are here for 90 minutes today, and Jason, Sara and Susan will be engaging in a three-way conversation, and perhaps there can be interaction with people here at the STOA. And I'll take in Jason in a moment, who will basically I'll hand the keys to Jason, Sara, and Susan, and use me as you see fit if you need help with anything. But I'll take in Jason now, and he can explain how today is going to look like. Jason and everyone, welcome to the STOA. And I think you can unmute yourself now. Yes, you have access.
Hi. Welcome, everyone. So feel free to turn on your camera if that feels comfortable. And we'll start just by putting where we're from in chat, and also 3 subjective words about how you're doing it in this moment, or 1 phrase about how you're doing right here in this moment. And so much of authentic relating is about coming right here, right now. And also attuning to others. So feel free to read the chat as we start to get a sense of who we are as a group. And yeah, I'm delighted to be here with Susan and Sara. I've definitely had dialogues with both of them in different contexts, either on my podcast or teaching together and all these things. And it's really cool to have the 3 of us together, which has never really happened before. And the context for this conversation is the authentic relating movement till now and where we're going in the future. And so we're going to talk quite a bit about that. And we're going to have a few little interactive pieces for all of you. So just as a show of hands, who's relatively new to authentic relating? Like maybe you've heard of it or done it once or twice, but they're relatively new to this practice. Okay, so no one who's on camera at least. And who's kind of medium spicy, like they've done 1 workshop or, dabbled in it, but they're still learning about it? Raise your hand. Okay. And then who's kind of taken the deep dive and is a connection junkie? Yeah. Seems like most of us on the call. And this does seem to be a characteristic of authentic relating. About 5 to 10% of the people who encounter it get really lit up by it, and they go really deep with it. And they take courses from multiple different companies, and it does seem to be a factor. So right now we're just going to have a, actually, Peter, will you pin the 3 of us? I think that might be appropriate with where we're going. That way people can leave it on gallery view, or they can be on gallery view if they want to see everyone, or they can just, yeah. So we're going to have about 3 to 5 minutes each, starting with Susan, and then myself, and then Sara, just talking about the origins of where all this came from, and some of the history, some of the different players who have made it what it is today. And that way we have like a whole list of topics. Well, we definitely won't get to all of them today, but excited to dive in. Susan, you want to jump in?
Hi, everyone. So we're going to look first at some of the historical antecedents of this movement. So I'm going to start with a screen share that summarizes some of this. All right, let me get this centered up. So first, just to put it in context, I think a movement or movements generally emerge in response to some social ill, lack, injustice, or imbalance in society. Like the women's movement was aimed at gender inequality, the civil rights movement, racial inequality. And in the early 60s, something began to emerge as a movement. We called it then the human potential movement, that was balancing a different kind of inequality. It wasn't an inequality, it was a history of people being very conformist, kind of rigid in their options about what an individual can do, because uniqueness, any kind of uniqueness, like if you had a different gender identity than male or female, that was completely out of the question in the 50s. So in the 60s, there began to emerge the human potential movement. And it was bringing to our foreground the untapped potential humans have for inner development, spiritual development, self-awareness, mutuality, transparency, conscious evolution, and systems thinking as an alternative to the old paradigm of materialism, consumerism, black and white thinking, that sort of thing. So some of the phrases that emerged out of that, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That's from systems theory, but body-mind connection began to be looked at, even in the medical community. We're all in this together. We began to think that way. And then more from the Asian influence of Buddhist psychology, be here now. So there was a lot of spiritual teachers coming over from India, for example. And Martin Buber had a phrase, I, thou, that the human potential movement picked up for its groups. The theme of what we were trying to do in our groups was I, thou, here, now. Human connection at a heart level, not so much just at a utilitarian level. So relationships began to be the focus. The relationship between things is much more interesting now, and how everything is mutually caused and mutually influenced. So this is a new paradigm that's emerging in the early 60s, and then it really came to the fore around 1967. 67 to 77, growth centers were popping up all over the United States and Europe. The most influential ones were NTL Institute. It was then known as National Training Laboratories. And that was in the East Coast in Northern Virginia, and the Esalen Institute in California. So this is where the encounter groups and the T groups started to happen. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But basically, those groups had that theme, I, thou, here, now. Speak from your own experience in the present moment, connect with the other person as you speak, experience your experience, don't just talk about your experience. So that whole, it really was a new flavor for what it means to be a good human being, rather than making money, looking like everybody else and that sort of thing. You guys didn't grow up in that world, but I came of age in the 50s, and that was a very different world than the late 60s. You've read about it, you've seen movies about it. And right around that same time, many books were written that published group exercises, group designs, dyad exercises. And I wrote some of them here, just in case you want to look some of them up, because they were very good, useful books, mostly written by professors. And let me just say too, that most of the people who led groups in those days were psychologists. I used to say, the only people that I could relate to were psychologists. And then, before 67, but after that, it's like everybody, I could relate to everybody. I mean, at least in my little world, because people were taking all these groups and they were getting more sophisticated about expressing feelings and even knowing what you're feeling. So the whole feeling side of a human being was getting more and more important. It's really kind of fun to have lived as long as I have and to remember that other world where, and I mean, that those pressures are still with us, but they're much different, at least within this subculture that we call the authentic relating movement. So those are just some of the books. There were also businesses were starting to teach this stuff. And in fact, they were the pioneers. That's the first I heard about T groups, was businesses were sending people. And then, I went and trained to be able to teach T groups in 1967. Many of the people who came to these groups in the growth centers in those days, because I was leading groups since 67, were clergy, businessmen, teachers. They just weren't the average person. They were people who tied it in with their professional development in some way. And a lot of times their organization paid for them to come to these groups. And professors, even before I started in this movement, professors like Carl Rogers at the University of Chicago were teaching college classes that were completely unstructured group process. And I would hear about those, and it sounded like complete chaos, because in those days we were very, very experimental, and we really didn't have too many ground rules or agreements. Carl Rogers was a real pioneer in this. And then 96 to 97 is when I started creating the Getting Real card game. I didn't start out to write a book. I created the game because I thought we really like to know what it's like for other people. We're really curious about other people. And I'm, I guess, somewhat of a voyeur myself. So I created this game, taking it to places like Burning Man and business conferences before it was really published, just to field test it and to see what questions worked, what questions didn't work, and that sort of thing. And during that time, I was also hosting honesty salons in my home, which were basically tea groups, let's just say. So I did not set out to be any kind of grandmother of any movement. Maybe we should call me the accidental grandmother. And I really didn't know that people were using my book, Getting Real, as part of their curriculum for a long time. It was probably in the early 2000s that I realized this, although I heard about some of this because some of the people that would come to my workshops were part of the Authentic Man program, Authentic San Francisco, Authentic Boston, those kind of organizations. So I did, all I was doing in the Getting Real practices were trying to help make the world safer for honesty and for differences and for each person's uniqueness. So I was more skill oriented. I wasn't attempting to create community, but I realized community was a very important thing. I was hoping coaches would pick this work up and bring it out into the world. So it is into this world that authentic relating emerged. And there's lots more influences, because when I used to attend workshops at Esalen, for example, I would be in groups side by side with Werner Erhard, Marshall Rosenberg, those kind of people. We were all studying from some of the same teachers like Gregory Bateson, Fritz Perls, Al Wang, those kind of people. Mainly at Esalen is where I met up with these guys. So I'm going to close my part, and if you have any questions about any of this, you can put them in the chat or ask them later on.
Thank you, Susan.
Stop the share here.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I love hearing about some of the historical parts, especially the part where you tested your card game at Burning Man. That feels so. And yeah, so just for my couple minute section on the history, as I study it more, like I'm finding more of the roots that you're mentioning, right? It turns out in Gestalt psychology, they actually used the term intersubjective meditation. And that's a term that we were using to describe circling, 10 years ago. And I didn't even know that term came from Gestalt. And so really starting 15 to 17 years ago in the Bay Area, you had this group of people who studied everything. They took all of the workshops, they took Landmark, and there was so much cross-pollination. And they really incubated something that I would say has an 80% overlap conceptually with what was happening before in the human potential movement, and especially with T groups of being in the present moment, I, thou, here and now, and really understanding that like some unique alchemical magic happens when we let the past go and we let the future take care of itself and we come right here and right now, like specifically as a practice, right? Because that happens all the time in normal flow of life, but you might come directly into the present moment for like 15 seconds and have a moment of intimacy. And then it's like, oh, let me check this. And it's like, we're off again. But when we actually set aside like an hour or 2 hours or a full weekend workshop to be in the present moment, something unique happens in our development. And so this group in San Francisco, who is Decker and Shayna James and Kendra Kunov and all of these people who really taught myself and Sara, they really brought it away from the therapeutic environment of like a therapist or a psychologist and a client. And they kind of brought it more into an egalitarian, like, hey, we can just do all of this inside of our friend group. And there was something about that allowed, even though the conceptual overlap was 80 or 90%, like they developed their own terminology and they were able to go deep. And that's when circling first was born. Guy Sangstock was one of the founders of that. And what is circling? It's actually a very advanced authentic relating game is one way that I think of it. You set aside an entire hour to focus on one person. That's one version of circling, right? And there's something in that so much development can happen for that one person it's almost like that person ends up with 6 therapists who are all paying attention to them with like this exquisite, really deeply attuned, curiosity-driven, acceptance-driven, and in normal flow of life, we have a wide array of motivations. But what happens when we come right here, right now, and our only motivation is acceptance? In other words, our only agenda is to drop our agendas, right? That's really where the magic started to happen. And so then the community moved to Boulder, Colorado, and about 10 years ago is when Sara and I got involved. And we really started to look at, in these deep, long workshops, like what is possible for human development if we really put relationship first. And this has really been an amazing community building experiment because now it's gone all over the world. Authentic relating is popping up in so many different places in so many different countries. I know, I just heard recently about it happening more in South America with different people being trained. And so there's been hundreds and hundreds of people being trained in this art form. And it is a certain kind of decentralized, leaderless movement. Like there's 10 people leading this movement or 200 people leading this movement, depending on how you count it. And so I think we have a long way to go, though. I think we're still learning a lot as a movement about what relational intelligence is and what interpersonal intelligence is. And as different than emotional intelligence, right? We know that authentic relating increases our emotional intelligence if we practice it earnestly for a few months or more. Yet we don't actually fully know exactly how interpersonal intelligence and emotional intelligence are different and how those interplay. And it does feel a little bit full circle with some of what you said, Susan, that it started as a skill-based thing with psychologists, and then it evolved into a community building thing. And now we're actually coming back more of like, okay, how do we train very specific skills? And that's what a lot of what I did with my book is like how to really get the curriculum to a much more specific, concrete thing that it's like, oh, I know I'm growing in this one piece. I know I'm growing in emotional availability. That's something that I want to give to the people in my lives. And there's, you know, a dozen other different teachings and distinctions around that. So that's what I'll say, and I'll pass it to Sara. And then we'll kind of get into a three-way dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm liking this backtracking and this placing of where we are within the time frame of like the gestalt of our times, and then also what Jason brought up of how the movement is evolving, which I think is characteristic of movements in general. So we have these like two things that are coming together now, right? Like us within culture and then almost the culture within us. So when I came on the scene in 2012, authentic relating, we got assigned Susan's book in the circling training that I took. I found authentic relating through a little manual of games that Decker and Brian had put out from their work initially in San Francisco and then with the Integral Center in Boulder. And I was like, wow, this stuff is really cool. I'm in Texas. I don't know about any of this. I'm just graduating school, but I want friends. And this seems like a cool way to make them. And I was at the time studying intentional living communities. And I was really curious about this question of how do people live, work, coexist in what the research I essentially found is called the Odyssey period of life. So there's this gap now between the time we graduate college, like usually our early 20s, and our mid or so 30s when a lot of people start families. And it used to be that gap just kind of didn't exist. Either people weren't going to college or they were starting families pretty soon afterwards. And so in that gap, there was starting to come up this real need and desire for community that then was also starting to expand beyond that age range, because even older adults were like, wow, community, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't only have to rely on our families, especially as the birth rate is falling and not everyone was choosing to have them. So it felt like I was tapping into, without realizing it, this real desire in my age group for community, for friend families, which I think we're still trying to invent what does that even look like. And it just so happened that authentic relating practices created community really quickly and easily. They just removed a lot of the blocks. I think of them as allowing us to play a different social game in which, because we know the rules, we have a lot more degrees of freedom instead of just assuming how we should act and interact and going to kind of the most basic level of like, okay, this is how loud I can be. This is how vulnerable I can be. This is the kind of questions I can ask because I know those work for the most number of people. I get a different set of rules, right? So people were finding, oh my gosh, I want to live with the people I'm meeting. I want to date the people I'm meeting. I want to be in community with them. I've talked to a couple people in the last few days who are members back of our community in Austin back in like 2012 to 2015 range. And it was like the high point of their lives, of all of our lives. It was just this co-creative, trying new things, bumping up against each other, forming community with each other sort of experience that none of us had really had or known could happen. So that's really what we were tapping into. And I started collating the games that I was finding from doing the Austin community and doing some, what I didn't realize at the time were experiments in open leadership, in let's train anyone, let's have anyone able to facilitate. Let's assume that we're going to rub our edges off on each other. And when I look back at those days, I'm like, whew, a lot of those people should not have been facilitators. And yet now they've evolved into some of our most skilled leaders. So it taught me a lot about different ways of doing leadership, which now has become one of the trends, I think, which is what is leadership, what is facilitation versus leadership. So now that there was this interest in community, and then as the movement has grown, we've started wanting to tap into larger societal currents because it's not financially sustainable to just do community. People aren't willing to really pay for it yet. And so we've bumped into these larger things, which are like mind, body, and mindfulness and trauma work. So engaging the whole self, which authentic relating taps into through the somatic and experiential parts of it. And then we've also tapped into facilitation as a norm instead of just leadership. I think agile methodology and has really brought a lot of that forward, because in agile, which is a huge movement these days, they have scrum coaches, and those are facilitators. And so there's been this, and agile calls a lot of their kind of customer assessment tools games. So we're starting to kind of explore the edges of how do we tap into what's happening now, even as we get more in contact with people like Susan and look at, well, where do we come from? Because for a long time, I think we had the very egocentric, like, we're doing something totally new and no one's ever done it before. And then I started talking to Susan and I was like, oh yeah, hi, Carl Rogers. So that's where I see us as now.
Nice. Thank you, Sara. So people have put some questions in chat already, and we're going to try to get to a lot of those. So feel free to put things in the chat. I answered one briefly. That was a simple one, but the one question from Rosa, which I want to ping over to Susan. I'll say my understanding, which might be totally off, and ping over to Susan. The parallels differences between AR and T groups, especially with regard to confrontation, which was not one of Carl Rogers' 3 necessary and sufficient conditions for personal growth, but was part of encounter groups. Yeah, as far as I know, encounter groups were kind of like edgy interpersonal groups where people would like bump up against each other and really grow that way. So like conflict was a part of it, whereas T groups were a little bit more of the academic and educational style groups that were led. And what a lot of people don't know is in the 70s, I don't know what year it was, but like encounter groups made the cover of Time magazine. Like that's what the human potential movement was. It was like you had 3,000 groups happening in America. And it was an entire movement the way that maybe mindfulness is now would be a good comparison. So what would you say to that, Sara, the parallels? Or Susan, sorry.
I agree with what you said about encounter groups versus T groups. And it was more the West Coast where the encounter groups were happening, at mostly Esalen. And it was the Wild West. People really didn't pay enough attention to safety. I mean, we evolved, and one of the things, and Rosa mentions confrontation, so I'll address that too. So as far as I know, T groups were not that confrontational in the era that I was teaching them, which was from 67 up to about 82. They were not that confrontational. It was very carefully led. Speak from your own experience. Stay on your own side of the net. There's no pile-ons. Be careful about your projections onto others. But on the other hand, on the West Coast, there were wrestling matches. I mean, people would get hurt. There was a lot of nakedness because Esalen, so halfway through the group, everybody'd take off their clothes, and I mean, not that was confrontation, but like I went to one where the leader, I was with my husband, and the leader said, what do you like best about your partner's body, and what do you like least about your partner's body? I mean, it was like that, okay? Wow. Buttons were being pushed all over the place intentionally. It was like, I got so strong in relationship to dealing with anger coming at me, because that had been a fear of mine until I entered this movement. Okay.
There was almost a parallel experience in kind of the 2000s and recently in the authentic relating movement, because Circling Europe came on the scene. It must have been 8 or 9 years ago. And I remember taking a course in New York City with you, Sara, and it was edgy AF. Oh my gosh. Like we really touched the edges of what it was like to be human, and what was acceptable, and really pushed the edges a lot. And they got a fair number of complaints about people being re-traumatized, and they had to like gear more towards safety. And I respect those guys so much. Like my leadership grew like crazy being in this 5-month course with them. And we cracked a lot of eggs to make the omelets, so to speak. Yeah. I think Sara had an internet thing. She just texted me. So
I'll just speak a little more to the confrontation and Carl Rogers thing that Rosa mentioned. Should I do that?
Yeah, please.
So it depends on how you define confrontation, but the Carl Rogers group, because I was in the early students of Carl Rogers, I was one of the early students, and just for other people, the 3 facilitative conditions, which Rosa calls the necessary and sufficient conditions for basically trust and safety, empathy, positive regard, and genuineness, as I recall. And confrontation was something that all of us were interested in, but this is the way we defined confrontation, was simply saying things like, I notice you're smiling while you're telling me your cat died, or something like that. You know, we'd noticed discrepancies. So that was what confrontation was in the literature. And I did my PhD thesis on confrontation and psychotherapy based on Carl Rogers' work, because this was part of the movement self-correcting. We realized that the facilitator was too shadowy, you know, so the facilitator's too shadowy. People were wanting more humanness from the therapist or the facilitator. And so that was one of the self-correcting things that happened. But then, of course, you can go too far in self-correction, too much confrontation. Now we have to correct backwards again. And there were many books written and research articles written about encounter group casualties. They weren't called T group casualties, though. So, you know, I'm not sure how you, Rosa, have experienced T groups, but I'll just say that much for now.
So, yeah, one of the overarching questions that we thought about is like, how do we handle safety as a movement inside of workshops, inside of authentic relating game nights in people's living rooms? You know, there's kind of this safety first culture, which is like, you know, make sure to respect everyone. And then there's a safety third culture, which is actually a phrase from Burning Man, if you're familiar with that. Sara, do you want to jump in on that at all?
Yeah, can you give me a little bit of context? My Wi-Fi just totally blipped.
Yeah, just the self-correction of like what happens when a group really goes for the edgy conflict.
Oh yeah.
Circling Europe style. And then we find out like, oh, people are actually being re-traumatized, and we have to like, you know, steer back towards safety, and like just those 2 parameters in community and how we handle, how do we handle safety?
For sure. That's actually been a really interesting question in Austin, because we started out as an AR community, and then Circling Europe. Austin is actually where I introduced Jordan to John and Sean, because they did an immersion down here, and they partnered and became what is now Circling Europe. And so Austin had this interesting mix of a pretty safety conscious AR community that I was leading, and then a lot of conflicts between me and Jordan about the level of safety of the circling community, which was really different than the style that I had trained in. And I think I learned there's like a whole bunch of stuff that I've taken away from it. One is that people oftentimes will kind of self-select in the safety that they want, and that safety breaches are oftentimes a lot less big than I think they are. Like, I was really scared in the early days that what was happening with Circling Europe was going to harm people on a really big level. And that was overall not the case. Like, there were definitely some people that had bad experiences where I was like, I would rather this not have happened. I would rather they have given more context about what the event was and wasn't, which is something I try to do a lot more these days. Like, hey, trigger warning, if you have these signs, like, maybe don't come to this. Like, on one of my events, it says, this is going to be triggering. If you don't have the capacity to hold yourself and others today, don't come to this event. So pre-framing, awesome. And people are a lot more resilient than I think they are. And as a leader, it's my job to ask the people to set very clear boundaries for the people that I think are not a fit, even after they're in the container, and just be like, hey, I'm noticing these things. just letting you know, here's what may come up here. Are you okay with that? And, you know, giving you the heads up. And then the last thing that I found is what sort of safety people need at different points during an event. So I start out events with a lot of holding, where I'm like, I will be the mom here. You can project all your mom stuff on me. I will hold the safe container for you. I will set the agreements. I'll make sure you know all of the leads. We'll do the game, you know, kind of the structured game activities. And then over the course of time, I'll decrease that a little more, and I'll start asking them to take more responsibility for their experience. And in my trainings these days, I even have that explicit. Like, here's a video about how I'm going to increase the level of agency throughout the training and how responsive I'm going to be based on that. So I like this idea of how do we train people into internal safety while also understanding that safety and the sense of it is going to be extremely relative. Like, I don't think that I think it's entirely in relationship to the environment. So if the environment feels unsafe to someone for whatever reason, I can't expect them to speak up for their needs. I have to be engaging with them and engaging with the environment and taking in feedback without making myself wrong for not knowing it in advance, because everyone is going to have different needs. I think the last thing I'll say is right now there's a movement towards like almost a self-righteous safety. Like, as the leader, you should have known in advance how much safety to create for me. And what I'm trying to learn is like, how do I help people speak up for themselves when they need safety and notice their needs, but also remind them that someday they're going to be in my shoes and they're going to be having to figure that out too. So how would they like me to respond? How would they respond if they were me? So it's delicate, and I'm really enjoying that exploration.
Yeah, I think it's really subtle because the level of safety that's created is a combination of what the leader does and how they set context, and them using their role power in an appropriate way, and every single other participant. Like, in my personality, I think I steer really far on the side of safety and like attunement and really creating like softness or like gentleness for other people. But when I'm in leadership, I try to actually, I remember for about a year when I was leading courses, I used to say sometime in the first hour, I would just say, this is not a safe space. I'm not here to create safety for you. We get to decide as a group. And I would like let it hang in the air and let like people's nervous system get a little bit amped up by it. And then I would say, well, it's actually a co-created variable that we're going to do together. And because, I think Brene Brown perhaps has this phrase of like, this is a brave space, right? This is a co-created dynamic. And there's so much that can be learned by pushing into our edge. And a lot of times we don't know where our boundaries are until they have been crossed, which means that if a boundary has been crossed, nothing wrong or bad has happened in a lot of cases, unless there's physical violence happening or something that's much more extreme. But like in most cases, when boundaries have been crossed, that's a moment to be like, oh, I get to learn about how I communicate and how I can communicate my boundaries, right? And the other person gets to learn about who is this person and what do they need that's different than other people. And it's an opportunity for intimacy, for getting to know one another and adjusting. Where do we want to go now?
I'll just say a summary thing then. So what Sara and Jason, what I get out of what you've been sharing is a little bit more about how a movement grows and changes and evolves in response to feedback. And so, one of our cutting edges now does have to do with much more awareness of trauma and people having trauma responses. Like Sara said, if you're not feeling safe, you can't even speak up for yourself. So the leaders being aware of that sort of thing, we're taking safety to a different level now, even and trying to train. I mean, in my groups, trying to train everybody to realize when you're triggered, when somebody else might be triggered, and just know that we're kind of wired together when we're in a group. So we're all in this together, and our nervous systems can feel it when somebody else is in distress. And that brings us more into the we space stuff, which I think is an emerging trend too in culture. And so that's kind of here
and interesting
in our world also now.
To speak to that, Susan, and I'd actually be really curious to hear your thoughts on this, and Jason's too, but I've been thinking about where we are from. I don't know how many of you know the kind of Ken Wilber integral levels. This was a big part of my initial training at the Integral Center, is this idea of egocentric, ethnocentric, world-centric, which essentially is like, how much is my focus, or a better way of saying it is like socialized self, individual self, collective self, might be based more on Robert Keegan's work. And I think, Susan, what you were speaking about is people coming out of the age of the socialized self, where we had really clear societal roles and who we were supposed to be. And then we started coming in Jason and my age very much into the individualized self. And I still think we're really in that mostly. So even this question of trauma and individual trauma is an individual question. And we keep seeing it in our groups as, well, how does the facilitator make space safe for the individual? And how can the individual speak up? And what is happening for the individual, which deprioritizes a lot of this we space idea, which is most at the cutting edge and kind of has been in the background, I think, for a very long time, which is how are we being affected by our environment, and how are we affecting others, and what are the ways that we kind of resonate in common, to use the more spiritual term. But that actually is happening. Like, you can track in a group over time how the safety of the group is evolving and how that's affecting the individual. Like, that's where you get these really like, oh, we feel so good together. That's not because every individual has decided to feel good together. That's because there's a group gestalt that's emerged. And so I think that's a space where this movement is existing and exploring right now as one of the things that has most been concerned with the we space since the beginning. But now having for us to go from, okay, we can set norms for participants and just have them follow, into this, now we have to pay attention to the experience of each individual and to the societal trends and figure out how to weave a we space from within those.
Yeah, the we space work is really beautiful because in a sense, what happens, like, we can actually even practice it right here, right now. I think that would be helpful. If we all just like breathe slowly and softly through our nose for like 30 seconds and just gaze around at the different faces on the screen. And just imagine what it would be like to go on a little bit of a magical journey with all of these people. Even if it was just for one day, and we got to like collectively care for one another, support one another. We got to listen to one another about our dreams and desires, right? Because so much of authentic relating is about listening. And we actually can drop more of like the rigid parts of our ego or our personality and merge. Like, it's safe to merge with the people on your screen energetically, emotionally. Just trying that out as a possibility, right? So just call out a word or a phrase of what that does. And that's a very entry level kind of guided meditation into something that might create a we space. In a weekend workshop, you would spend a lot of energy doing that. Like, what happens when I just do that for 30 seconds? How does that change your focus? How does that change your being? And you can type it into chat. Calming. And so a lot of the authentic relating facilitators don't have credentials as a psychologist. The vast majority of us don't, even though we've been trained in how to do something that's very similar to group process work, which is led by a psychologist. And so we have been trained how to create these group field experiences. That's another, I'm not a big fan of the term we space. I think group field is a little bit of a better term personally. But in that space, there's opportunity for learning, there's opportunity for co-regulation, there's opportunity for people getting their belonging needs met. And there's also an opportunity for hurting one another more because there's group intimacy that happens. Do you want to chime in on this, Susan?
Well, I'm thinking of how the opportunity for hurting one another. That's where my mind went. I just grabbed onto that and I was nodding. All I have to say about that is obviously the more interconnected we feel, the more we care, the more the loss of connection triggers people. So I maintain that mostly what triggers people is some sense of loss of connection or fear of loss of connection. And we're in the connection business, but helping people notice what creates loss of connection. I think that's a big part of our movement. And when are opportunities for connection present that you either take or don't take? And to me, all the skills that we're learning together in the authentic relating movement, these are things we intend to spread out into people's lives in the world so they can oh, there was an opportunity for connection that I just missed with my spouse. Let me go and correct that. So I just wanted to pop in with that piece.
I'll name a thought that's on my mind with that. Also, I'm loving these comments in chat, especially Sherry's. I appreciate the increase of live humans coming on video since Jason's prompt. It was such a beautiful way to just bring us into presence together. So one tag that's on my mind is just doing this on video and the ways that has changed, and the fact that we found that you really can do this on video, and that human connection is ubiquitous, and that feeling connected is ubiquitous, whether we're in person or online. I've found that really fucking cool, and what I think that says about the way that humans relate with each other. I also want to name that the question of what connection really is and what forms of it we're working with and not is also a big question that's up for me these days. Since time immemorial, we've had this question of, well, do people come to our groups for dating? And what happens if that's what they want? Is sex and relationship? Is that, less of a pure goal than I just want to become friends with people, or I want to deepen my relationship with my spouse or my friends? And so, or making friends as an adult as a form of connection, or connecting with coworkers, and how we do connection when there's hierarchy at play, which is a different set of norms. So one of the things I think I've been really exploring in the last couple years is within the definition of connection, how can we offer opportunities even for when people want to end connection with each other or aren't getting along, like the debate around polarization that's been happening the last 2 years or so. How do we have conflict better, which is what Jason's book is all about. So I feel like that's one thing that's happening right now, is really expanding the frontiers of what group and individual relating looks like when it's not going to be peaceful and deepening.
I like going to the really meta question of wait, what is connection anyway? Right? Because connection might mean we're doing a project together, we have the same mission, and because we're accomplishing something together, we feel connected. Think of a sports team, or obviously so much that happens at work. Connection might be we're making meals together and talking about things that are happening in the world, right? People do this all the time. And I think what we're studying in authentic relating is a much, we say we're in the connection business. I love it when you said that, Susan. I think it's actually a small subset of connection that we're really focused on, which is essentially platonic intimacy, right? It's like if I have eye contact and I'm in the present moment with another person, there's something else happening. There's something else that gets invoked. We're invoking our heart is one way to say it. And you can have like even a small amount, a tiny bit more intimacy with a cashier, in your life might look like looking them in the eye and like really genuinely being interested about them, instead of treating that as just a transaction, right? And it's actually really interesting to experiment what happens when you bring the relational dimension of life into every piece, right? And I know I kind of went back to your original question instead of commenting on what you were saying towards the end, Sarah. I don't know if we want to pick up, which thread we want to pick up.
There's a number I could see going towards right now. There's this idea of conflict and how do we use AR tools to navigate that. I know there's another thing that we've been meaning to talk about like intimacy in one night stands or development versus connection. So I want to say we can take the direction, but I think I want to pause for a minute and just hear. I'd love to get a couple of things that y'all are mulling on as you hear us talking. Could be something that you want us to speak to, or just awarenesses that are coming for you. I'd love to just like pause for a minute and do that. And then Tim, I see your hand, but I'd love to get a couple comments and then grab your question.
Are you wanting people to come on audio or put it in chat, Sarah?
I think in chat for now, just so we get a couple of thoughts. How can AR address the meta crisis is one. Tim, do you want to speak yours?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just share real quick. After having just been at an authentic relating event this weekend, I noticed in conversation the other day, and this is kind of related to some of what was just shared, but how I was telling a story about something that had happened in my life, but really finding myself asking the question, why is what I'm sharing right here in this moment with this particular person, why does that feel important? Like bringing the relational aspects into what I'm sharing, because sometimes I find there are things that are important to me, but I don't really ask the question of like, what is it about what's happening right here and now that makes me want to share that story, and how can I bring that person more into my world? Like, what is my actual goal in having this interaction? And yeah, I just really loved how the practice kind of brought me more into presence, into asking less about what my experience is and how more about what is my experience with this person right now, and how is it that I'm actually wanting to connect. So I've just very much appreciated the practice for bringing that awareness to me.
Yeah, one of the tools in my book is called Saved by Context. And if we, in the beginning, say what our goals or motivations are, like, hey, I really want this with you, and then we blurt out the thing that was the thoughts going through my head, it generally goes well. But if a lot of times, if we're out of tune or out of sync with another person and we're just sharing a story or sharing a bunch of things, and there's like a quizzical look on their face, we can actually just share the context in the middle or at the end, like, oh, I said all of this because I'm really wanting this other thing with you. And like, and so really revealing our motivations is like an AR master tool. Like there's so many situations that it applies to. That's what I heard in what you said, Tim. Yeah. Relational code switching, similar.
There's on that mode, Peter, I'll say something that the Integral Center used to teach that I really loved was this idea of different types of conversation. They used to say it as levels, but I'm not as much of a hierarchy person. At least in the sense that there's informational, which is just that we're, talking, giving information to each other. So this is what I do for work. This is where I'm from. This is what you need to know about me. And then emotional, which is like, what are the emotions that underlie that? How do I feel about my work? how is it to be in this job or in this space? And then relational, which is as I'm with all of you, or as I'm with myself with you, what is the quality of that relationship? And something my teacher Decker used to say is that we usually don't get to that level unless something is ending, whether it's a relationship or somebody's dying. We just don't talk about that. And so I think for a lot of us, Tim, something that you pointed out, or a reason I think of like that I have a fear of going to that relational space is it feels dangerous on some level. And my explanation for that currently is because most people only have that association with something bad is going to happen. We're talking about this because something is wrong. That's the only time it's happened in my life. I know I've found that with my partner, who's like not an AR person initially. It's really scary for him to have those conversations. I need to give context a lot in advance. I need to message him in the morning saying, hey, I'd love to have this, conversation in the evening. Here's my intention. Here's what I'd love you to think about in advance. Are you open to that? So it's an interesting space getting into that relational and really rewiring some of our expectations about it. And sometimes that takes a long time of being in community together. And then I'll say one more thing on that. Well, actually, I want to connect that to like what you said, Peter, about circling as intimacy without friendship. So looking forward to going into that idea of intimacy, one night stands, and what happens when we get into this new relational space. But I want to give Jason or Susan a chance to talk first. Susan,
I was back on the theme of conflict and how the emerging AR practices, I think, have a lot to offer the polarized situation in our world today. And I think a lot of us are just dipping our toes in that water, right? A lot of us facilitators. And one of the things, just picking up on how we have really brought context to awareness for people. So I'm having a discussion about, let's say, whether to get vaccinated or not vaccinated with somebody who's suspicious of the vaccine and somebody more trusting of the vaccine. So there's there's a conversation going on there. If we put the context as really hearing each other, or the context as understanding your life experience that led you to this place, or first setting some kind of context that suggests healing. That's one thing that I think we know how to do. Another thing, I think both Jason and Sara just mentioned, sort of the levels of where you're coming from, like the underlying motivation. There's I want to be heard with my beliefs, but what do I really want with you here and now? I want to feel respected, etc. So we, getting to the underlying, using basically it's negotiation skills. And I think we are bringing that in. Okay, people have their positions, but what are the interests, the needs, the deeper human part of what's going on? And so I know the more I care about somebody, and so this is where caring and connection comes in. The more I care about somebody, the more painful it is if we're watching different movies. And that is actually one of my triggers when I'm reaching out to somebody that I really care about and we can't connect because we're really seeing different realities. But being able to express the pain that I'm feeling, not being able to connect with you, keeping things much more experiential and here and now, I think has great healing potential for some of these polarized issues in our world today.
can I speak to the conversation going on in chat, actually?
Yeah.
There's a really interesting one where Linnea brought up a kind of issue with somebody, a leader in a circling or AR practice, trying to get her into bed after having done the practice. And like any movement, circling and AR have these stories. Something that I've been thinking about a lot lately that I find interesting is the shadow side of really open communication. And I'm thinking about this because I'm now between the authentic relating community and my partner's community, almost half and half. And my partner's very like default world, performers, artists, actors, nightlife, like parties all the time, lots of alcohol. And in that community, which I'd consider more default, there's a lot of passive communication and passive control. It's when somebody does something wrong, there's like a side comment, there's a joke, there's something that puts that person in their place. And in AR, you can't do that. In part because people have a lot of trauma around that, right? Like, how many people here have trauma around like some sort of passive communication? You can't quite come back at it, but you know you're being put down. Yeah. So in AR, we get rid of that. And that's wonderful. But on the other hand, it's way harder to enforce social control because you have to bring it up. You have to speak for it. You have to advocate it. It has to be verbal. And so there's actually in some ways more space for bad actors or narcissists to take over because there's not a lot of ways to push back at them unless it becomes a community process. And I don't think that our communities yet have a really good way around it. It's why this conversation around safety is so apt, but also so difficult. Like, we want to put norms in place that have people acting ethically towards each other, but we're also dealing with people in the AR community. We also get a lot of people whose social skills are quite underdeveloped, and they're trying to learn them for the first time in an environment where there are explicit rules, but you're getting people's like edges bumping up against each other all the time, and everything has to be like active communication. So I don't have a solution to it, but I think that's one of the reasons why communities, the kind of conscious community, can get rife with narcissists, because it's easier to take advantage of that when you don't have the instant somebody does something fucked up and someone else makes an offhand comment and they go, oh, okay, this is not the right place to do that.
Yeah, so fascinating, Sara. And we all have an inner 2 or 3 or 4-year-old. We all have an inner narcissist. We all are actually capable of narcissism when we're triggered or traumatized or re-traumatized, right? And so there's some critiques of the authentic relating movement that I just want to say like are very valid. Like, if we're really prioritizing feelings, if we're really delving into our feelings, like so much more, like twice as much, or maybe even 5 times as much as the default world, we can get lost in that. We can get lost in those places, and they can be eddies of growth. And in a way, if I am prioritizing my feelings all the time, that's called narcissism, right? We actually have to balance everything that we're experiencing with the group, with other. And so, I think we're still maybe a toddler, maybe like mid-grade school as a movement. I think we're still growing up. And I think these other kind of protections that are in the default world do need to be included in some way. So we have 20 plus minutes left. Where do we want to go? What thread is on your mind, Susan?
Well, the critiques of the AR, which you were starting, I think might be good to flesh that out just a little bit more. Mm-hmm. And then I also was thinking of like sex in groups, okay, this is platonic intimacy, but I thought that might be interesting for me to learn from you guys what's going on there. But could we do a little of the critique, continue with what Jason said?
Yeah, shadows and critiques of the authentic relating movement. Like, you can even put them in chat and we can discuss.
Yeah.
Could we touch on the intimacy one night stands ones to start?
Yeah.
Some interesting thoughts with that.
Yeah.
And then I'm also seeing a question around the future of AR to get to at some point. Does one of you want to speak on this idea of kind of false intimacy one night stands, like these practices creating a lot of closeness, but then that closeness not always existing after the event?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing I could say is that at the end of all of the NTL trainings, the T group trainings, we always had a final session on transition to back home and making people really aware that this is a cultural island and things are intensified, and all your needs are getting met here for attention and love, and then you're going to a different culture when you go back. And it's, a few of the cautions. So we always had that, and I'll do a little bit of that at the end of my workshops in terms of back home, what to expect and that sort of thing. And I wonder if you guys have any kind of a module that cautions people, because so many people back in the old days would fall in love, really fall in love and go home and say, I want a divorce. I mean, that was one of the critiques in the 60s.
Yeah, I think this is a very valid critique. Like, it's not very good for monogamy. Like, right, authentic relating, like just going in there and like mixing your energy with all these other people who may be married or single, like it can disrupt relationships. And yeah, I think it's a really valid critique. And also, like, how do we work with that? I think it's really just a specific teaching around like, hey, this is community. And in community, you might go deep with a group of people, but they're probably not going to be the closest people in your life 3 months from now. Like, there's something different around friendship. And friendship in our culture can be very temporary or very surface level. I mean, who here has over 1,000 Facebook friends, right? And like, how often have you actually interacted with 90% of those people? Whereas I think and this is just a speculation, but if I imagine, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, friendship was like for life. And it didn't matter, like you would write letters to this person, every 2 weeks for your entire life. And that's what it meant to be in a friendship, and so really just, I think most of these workshops and most of these places are places we can actually just exercise our hearts and exercise our relationship skills. And we have to create our friendships separately. They can overlap, but it's sometimes temporary. Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to find a good analogy for this, but sometimes it's like in common culture, we don't get as open with people as we do in spaces like AR. If you consider openness being sharing parts of myself that are less commonly told to others, except for close friends. And I'm doing it in AR because it's very specifically oriented towards that kind of sharing. In the same way that I might have a peak experience with someone, like say I go on a mountain climb with a couple of friends, right? And it's all focused towards doing this big thing that we've never done before. And at the end, we're like, oh my God, we just summited this mountain together. We have this feeling of accomplishment. We have this thing that we've now shared. We're going to be friends for life, right? And then you go back to your lives and you're like, well, our lives aren't all about summiting mountains. Like, we're in different places. We live in different places. We have different interests. We're different people. And yet you also have this bond, and it can be really confusing. Like, we felt so much intimacy. Shouldn't that mean something? And I think of it in the same way of like, I go to a psychology class with someone and I have this great intellectual connection and we learn this thing together. But for some reason in that space, we don't expect that now we're going to be friends with each other around psychology forever. So we have this assumption about what intimacy and what spaces that feel intimate should mean and lead to that just isn't quite the same in AR, because what we're doing is climbing a mountain together. We're not getting to know each other over a period of several months, sharing all sorts of different experiences to see exactly where we align in every aspect of our lives. So there's this really interesting fallacy there. And I really loved what Peter said about doing AR mostly with really close friends, where it's like, the reason that I do AR and circling these days are to help groups have better connection skills with each other for when conflict arises. So basically better tools for like fixing micro withholds and micro instances of lost connection. Helping facilitators have better skills for working with the dynamics of groups instead of against them, and with the people who are closest in my lives. Like right now, my goddaughter has brain cancer, and we're working in my household of people that have studied AR with how to be with her. And without those tools, we wouldn't be able to do that. Like my community, this is the second massive crisis we've experienced this year, and the first was walking a community member through his passing with ALS. Being able to talk with each other when things get tough, and having followed up on the intimacy of those instant connections with AR very intentionally, really has created a different quality of relationship. But that wasn't just from bumping into each other at a games night and saying, wow, we were so connected. Like, this should mean something. It took work to get it there. Sorry, that was kind of a bomb. It's just
no. I think we're just in a transition point, and I love what you said, Sarah. I think it's really important. I think we're in a transition decision point. What threads do we want to talk about before we think about closing? Because we are coming towards the end.
We had the future of authentic relating.
Oh yeah.
Theme, which may be time to talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that ties in with some of the critiques, perhaps.
Yeah. I think let's go there now, because we've done the past, we've done the present. Where are we going? And more of my conversations are, ironically coming full circle. And in the clinical world, like training therapists to have more relational intelligence, and like actually training therapists to incorporate authentic relating into their practices and into their group work. I think that cross-pollination is happening more and more. I think the cross-pollination between authentic relating and business is happening more and more. And I really think that is where this is going, and the cutting edge is like, how do we research this? How do we validate this? How do we have it be more specific, more concrete, more practical, so that it can go beyond just a movement where people get their belonging needs met, which is absolutely amazing, but to something that Sara and I and all of the authentic relating leaders out there really believe that authentic relating can improve people's emotional intelligence within 3 to 6 months if people earnestly practice it. It's pretty fast. It's really remarkable, but we don't have the research to prove that. And so, are we ever going to be taken seriously by the academic world and by the business world and the education world until we can actually validate our claims that are anecdotal at this point? I think that's a big part of where we're going.
So part of what you're saying is this inclusivity, exclusivity question, bringing the language of authentic relating, like when we bring it into the business world, we have to have a much stronger rationale for why we're doing this activity. How's it going to help you with your supervisor, with your customers, that sort of thing. And one of the chat comments, and I don't remember who said it, but had to do with, apparently some people have the image of, if you belong to the authentic relating community, you're going to have to bump up against values of polyamory and that sort of thing. And I don't feel comfortable in that community because I don't identify with that. I picked that up from one of the chat things. And I'm thinking, in any group, there's like one of the things I love is a thing called the differentiation design that we used to use with large groups, which was, okay, we're a group who all agrees, with authentic relating, but how many people are poly, identify as mostly poly? Go to that corner of the room or raise your hand. How many prefer monogamy? raise your hand or go to that corner of the room. And then, okay, how many of you who were poly have a disagreement about, some other value that, what would another value be? Like safety. Think the leader's responsible for safety, or safety is an inside job. Okay, so you polarize, you see how many polarities are within any little subculture. And I'm not sure if we do much of that sort of myth busting, but I kind of think that AR equals poly is probably a myth. I don't know. Or it's not a myth.
I think it depends.
I think, yeah, I don't think the majority of the people interested in AR are polyamorous. I think it's still, it's
AR has a wide overlap with the alternative community when we're talking specifically about authentic relating within community. Because the sort of people you're getting are the people that want to try new ideas and want to try being in community together, and agape and eros and all of these things. And so you're self-selecting not for the practice, but for the style of community and member, I think, and people move in those sorts of communities.
And I think that was true 5 to 10 years ago, that it had a lot of cross-pollination with the ecstatic dance community and, alternative spirituality communities. And that's what I mean by the future of the movement is cross-pollination, is like cross-pollinating authentic relating with wilderness therapy, cross-pollinating authentic relating with, working with teenagers or working with bullying. Like that's really how it's spreading, and what I hope continues to happen.
Yeah, and just to make the group more inclusive, that was my point. Is I think that is something we're aiming toward.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to speak a little bit to this future of AR as well. And Jason, I actually have an interesting disagreement with you here, because I used to think the same about the necessity for research. And then some research did come out with AR. Like there has been a couple articles posted on it, and Project Aristotle came out, Google's study that correlated psychological safety to being able to read people's social cues, which has been really, really helpful for me to cite within businesses. I've worked within a lot of businesses since that study came out. And there are some organizations for whom that research is really helpful. Like I'm a huge fan of Authentic Relating International, who's doing work within prisons, which is a more staid environment. Also a huge fan of Seek Healing out of Asheville, that's using authentic relating and circling practice in addiction recovery. And they actually are doing a fair amount of research in conjunction with neuroscientists and psychologists on this, or sociologists. But there's something about translation is one of the things that we're going towards, is like in different fields, the term of authentic relating, the idea of, psychological safety, which is the business term for this, or mindfulness or whatever, like what are the terms that are being used for something similar to what we have? And then also, what of what we have is actually useful? And to what extent? Because when I go into businesses and they want an emotional intelligence workshop, it doesn't actually change their culture. What they need is culture change if things are really going to take root and change the norm. And I don't yet know if authentic relating has all of the tools for that, because it requires a certain degree of willingness to lean in, that we need to kind of, there needs to be coaching that happens with the leaders first. There needs to be an understanding from things like reinventing organizations of how cultures develop and change. So figuring out where our tools go, I see as one of the major hefts. And then for me, a lot of my work right now is also on developing variants of the tools for some of the biggest problems of our time. So developing models that take games like Translator and apply them to conversations on polarization, which is what I've been doing with Rebel Wisdom, or creating a typology system for different ways people can connect that includes the authentic relating norms, but isn't only explicit to them, also includes storytelling and challenging and observing and things like that. So I'm really curious. I think that's what the AR movement is doing, is it's like all sorts of consulting and businesses and communities and such are being founded, and individuals are really trying to find how this works in their own areas, and it's really undercover. So a lot of the things y'all are pointing at, people are exploring that, like Naomi and Ine, there's a lot of folks doing this in the mainstream, but the other thing that needs to happen is those threads getting brought together and those people talking with each other, because there's no there's no centralized hub for that information to get disseminated, except for, to some extent, the Authentic Relating Event Facilitators Facebook group. But I don't really know of a lot of others.
So part of training for any facilitator who's going to go into a different subculture, like the business subculture, would be a kind of cross-cultural awareness. Like, these are the things to watch out for when you go into this culture, just like Margaret Mead wrote the book a long time ago about, you go into a tribe and you find out, well, what are the norms and values of this tribe? But you know, when I go into a business, we always look at the norms and values, and then how are these working for you? You know, we start there. Oh, well, I'm not safe to say a whole bunch of things to my boss, but I can say it to just about everybody on my team in the bathroom, but not in the meeting. You know, so surfacing norms and values that are dysfunctional, and then addressing those with the AR tools that we have.
So I'd love to leave it open for our host, Peter, in the last 5 minutes or so. Is there anything that you would like to hear us to talk about that you think would be particularly useful to you or to the STOA as a community?
Perhaps even 5 minutes, maybe go around, hear any kind of parting thoughts, or maybe like what you each want from the movement, given that you gave so much to it. I think that would feel meaningful for me to hear.
So what do I personally want from the movement? Is that a way to phrase the question? Sara and Susan and Jason answer that question. Is that what you're saying?
But yeah, just it would be cool for a checkout for each one of you to, you know, share some thoughts, and maybe if you can morph a question out of what I said, and something about you know, what do you want from, you know, there's sort of like the thoughts and where the authentic relating movement is going, but what do you want from it personally?
I love how you're making this relational, Peter, because as a teacher and facilitator, I often find myself in this role dilemma where it's like, oh, I really like doing this, and I really like explaining things, and I like my career, and I like my role, and sometimes I want to not be in that role, and it actually feels more human. It feels more connecting to not be in that role. And so I think if I was to be a touch selfish or really focus on what I desire, it would be I guess it's more like experiences of people relating to me for just me, just who I am as Jason, and not as some teacher / facilitator, or and I don't even know what that would look like. And actually, when you said, Peter, I only do AR with close friends, I'm like, yes, that was like a hell yes for me in my system. And it's actually where my life is going. It's like, oh, I actually want to do this with the same group of people. And so it's like, what I want is always kind of like manifesting and unfolding. And so, yeah, thank you for this question, which is a fun way to end. Mm-hmm.
One of the things that comes up for me, what I want, is the opportunity to interact with people like you, Jason, and you, Sara. I want some more of that, and other coaches and facilitators in the AR movement. I want that just to, because I'm really passionate about this movement, but it's not my movement by any means. And you guys, figured out how to use language in different ways and how to use the internet and so forth. So I just want to kind of keep up, because I'm in the older generation. So I want to keep interacting around facilitation and leadership. And I'm quite interested in interacting with people who are leaders of a community of practice. And I have a number of friends in my geographical locale that I'm going to be inviting over. And just what are the challenges of a leader of communities of practice, like when people don't like you to lead, for example. Okay, so that's mine.
Totally invested in both of your answers, Jason and Susan. I'm glad I went last. It took me a second to think about this. First of all, I feel like I'm getting so much from this already that there are a few desires. I feel engaged and like I'm working really hard every day for something valuable. I also feel like for the last 10 years, I've been on the cutting edge of something, and that is very tired. It's knocking on a lot of doors, wanting them to open. And I'm excited for if and when the authentic relating movement catches a break. Like right now, it's like I'm coaching someone in a super conservative community how to bring social connection practices for addiction recovery. I'm working with financial technology companies, trying to teach them skills for having better conflicts. I'm working with my family. I'm just coming off of being in the hospital for a week and a half every day, like seeing the way that doctors are relating with their patients and like what sorts of skills could be used in order to have those more whole health conversations and bring the soul into it. So like places where people, like some opportunity to get this out to a large group of people that actually want to engage with the skills at their heart, like having real conversations, sharing withholds, talking about relationship, understanding the really diverse ways that each person engages, and understanding how groups form norms, like those sorts of skills. That's what I really want. Like I want AR to catch its break, and I want that to ripple out through the movement so that the many leaders that have been honing their skills in huge ways can all be involved in that, instead of it being an individual company who gets it.
And maybe I'll do some closing shares. I guess maybe I'll start with gratitude, just for you three and what you do, and then when I first discovered authentic relating, I was heavy into like doing Toastmasters and doing all this like public speaking and personal development with my social skills. And after a public speech I did, someone came to me on the subway because they were there and they saw me. He says, "Have you ever heard of circling?" I'm like, "What is this circling?" And he says, she didn't know how to describe it. She said, "I can't describe it to you. You just got to go check it out." And I'm like, "Okay, I'll check it out." And then Taylor, who's in the room, he's the Authentic Relating Toronto. And I went to it. I'm like, what the fuck is this? It's just like, whoa, it's like my whole kind of like just world shifted. I didn't like it at first, but I liked it. And then I kept going. And then it was a game changer, really, how to like relate with people. And then I got hooked, like a lot of people get hooked when they do it. And it's just, yeah, like what Jason was talking about, just sort of being honest with your motivation and just sensing other people's motivation structures. And people can take you never met the person before, but if they touch circling or authentic relating, you can just sink in with them with some authentic goodness. And it's already rippling out. Like, my things with like looking at all these intellectual movements, and the meta modern movement is doing circling, the rationalist movement's doing circling, Extinction Rebellion is doing these intersubjective practices. And it's like a Trojan horse that's just getting through the culture, so people can really talk that have these differences. And so it's like the revolution's already happening, but it's decentralized. And it's because of, you three and people like you are doing the good work. So yeah, just sending you a lot of love and gratitude for doing what you do, and encouragement to keep doing it. And thanks for coming to the STOA today for doing the session. Yeah, I don't have any closing announcements, but you can check out, we have Alexi. Alexi, you're here. You got a session tomorrow on authentic relating, but with a twist.
Yeah, we having a session about STEAMology, how the STEAM and ancient culture of STEAM create the place for human encounter. Actually, that's a close topic to authentic relating, but have roots in ancient tradition. and it will be on
Friday. Yeah. You can check it on thestoa.ca. I had a coaching call with Alexi, and he came out of a steam bath, and he was like mixes Banya culture, Russian culture with circling, so it's pretty cool. Yeah, so that being said, Susan, Jason, Sarah, and everyone, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today.
Thank you, Peter.
Close up by listening to some Kanye.